I came home on a Tuesday afternoon and found my business partner in my kitchen, sitting at my table, drinking my coffee, with my wife's hand resting on top of his. That was it. That was the moment. Not a film scene, not a dramatic confrontation with raised voices and broken dishes. Just two people who went very still when they heard the door open. And me, standing there in my work boots, holding a bag of groceries from the New World on Morehouse Avenue, looking at something I couldn't unsee. I'm 63 years old. I've been a plumber for 40 years. I've seen a lot of things in people's homes, things people would be embarrassed about, things they'd rather keep hidden. I've learned over the decades that most people are doing their best, and most situations have more going on beneath the surface than you can see from the outside. I thought that made me patient, measured. I thought I understood people. I didn't say a word. I put the groceries on the floor by the door. I turned around, and I left. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that I'm a grandfather of 4, a semi-retired tradesman, and someone who spent 31 years believing he had a solid marriage. What matters is what happened next, and what I learned from it, because I think a lot of people, especially men, my age, have been taught to absorb things quietly, to keep the peace, to not make a scene. And sometimes that's wisdom, but sometimes it's just silence in the place where your self-respect used to be. Let me go back a bit. My wife, I'll call her Wendy, because that's her name, and she made her choices publicly enough that I don't feel the need to protect her privacy. And I met in Christchurch in 1991. She was working at a dental practice on Colombo Street. I was there getting a cracked molar sorted. She was the receptionist. She had a laugh that you could hear from the waiting room, and she remembered your name when you came back. I asked her to dinner after my second appointment. She said she'd think about it. She rang me 3 days later and said she'd thought about it. We got married in 1994. We bought our first house in Halswell in 1997. We raised 2 kids, a son who now lives in Brisbane with his family, and a daughter who's up in Auckland doing something in digital marketing that I only half understand. By the time our kids had left home, Wendy and I had built something that looked, from the outside, like a good life. A real one. The business partner's name is Trevor. I'd known Trevor Ashby for 14 years. We'd been in business together for 9 of those. A small plumbing and drainage company that we'd grown from basically nothing into something that employed 7 people and had a solid reputation across the Canterbury region. We'd been to each other's Christmas dose. His kids had been at our barbecues. His wife Lorraine had gone on a weekend trip to Queenstown with Wendy and 2 other women the year before. That's the part that took the longest to process. Not just the betrayal of my marriage, the betrayal of 14 years of what I thought was genuine friendship. The cups of tea after site visits. The arguments about quoting jobs too cheap. The time Trevor drove me to the hospital at 2 in the morning when I had a kidney stone and sat in the waiting room for 4 hours because he didn't want to leave me there alone. You think you know someone. I found out later, much later, in pieces, from different people, that it had been going on for about 8 months before that Tuesday. Wendy and I had hit a rough patch, the way couples do after the kids leave. And you realize you've been so focused on being parents that you forgot to keep being people to each other. I knew we'd grown distant. I thought it was the kind of distance that takes effort to close, the kind that most couples work through eventually. I didn't know she'd decided to close it with someone else. What I didn't know either was what I walked back into that night. I drove around for about 2 hours after I left the house. I went down to the estuary and sat in my ute watching the birds. I'm not embarrassed to say I cried, not from sadness. At that point, more from the shock of it, the physical shock of realizing that the shape of your life is different from what you thought it was. It's a strange sensation, like reaching for a wall in the dark and finding there's nothing there. I went back after about 2 hours because I had nowhere else to go, and because, frankly, I was 62 years old and I'd paid off that house. I wasn't going to sit in my ute on the banks of the Avon all night like I'd done something wrong. When I came in, Wendy was sitting in the lounge. Trevor was gone. She started talking before I'd even sat down. Not apologizing, explaining. That's an important distinction. She said she was lonely. She said I worked too much. She said she felt invisible. She said it just happened. That phrase, it just happened. As if the two of them had accidentally fallen into a situation over 8 months without either of them making a single conscious choice. I sat in the armchair across from her and I listened. Not because I thought she deserved to be heard, I'm being honest here, but because I'm a person who finishes things properly before he moves on. I wanted to hear what she had to say so that later, when I made my decisions, I could do it without wondering. When she'd finished, I said, "I'm going to need some time to think." She said, "Don't shut me out." I said, "I'm not shutting you out. I'm thinking." I went to the spare room. I didn't sleep much. I lay there in the dark and went through 31 years in my head. The way you do, picking up moments and looking at them differently now that I had new information, trying to figure out which parts had been real. Most of it, I think, had been real. That's the complicated part. The marriage wasn't a lie from the beginning. It just became one at some point without me noticing, and maybe I played a part in that. I've thought about it a great deal, and I think there's an honest answer there. Yes, I could have been more present. Yes, I got absorbed in the business. Yes, there were years where I treated our marriage like something that would keep running as long as nobody actively broke it. But I also know that none of that justifies what she chose to do. You don't fix a lonely marriage by creating a secret one. You have a conversation. You go to counseling. You tell the truth. You give your partner the chance to respond. She didn't do any of that. She made a choice, over and over, for 8 months. And she made it with my business partner, in my house. And she looked me in the eye across dinner every night and said nothing. That's what I couldn't get past. I spent the next week in a kind of practical mode. I've always been that way under pressure. I stop feeling and start doing. I rang my solicitor, a woman named Patricia, who'd helped me set up the business years earlier. I had a long conversation with my accountant. I pulled out our financial records and started understanding exactly what we had and what a fair division would look like. I wasn't trying to punish Wendy financially, I just wanted to know the facts before I walked into any conversation that required decisions. I also had to deal with the business. Trevor rang me on the Wednesday. I let it go to voicemail. He rang again on Thursday. I let that go too. On Friday morning, he turned up at a job site where I was doing a final inspection, a new build-out in Rolleston, and I had to make a decision in real time about how to handle it. He came towards me with his hands slightly open, the way people do when they want to show they're not a threat. He said my name. He said he was sorry. He said he didn't know how it happened. That phrase again. He said he valued our friendship and our partnership, and he wanted to find a way forward. I looked at him for a long moment. I said, "Trevor, I need you to not come to my job sites or my home without an appointment from now on. If you have something to say about the business, put it in writing to my solicitor." He looked like he wanted to say more. I turned back to the job. I won't pretend that was easy. My hands were shaking when I walked away. But it was the right thing. Not dramatic. Not aggressive. Just a clear boundary, delivered calmly, and then I went back to work. Because work was the one thing that still made sense that week. The business took about 4 months to unwind properly. We had a formal structure, which made it complicated: assets, contracts, ongoing jobs, staff to consider. Patricia earned her fees that quarter, I can tell you that. In the end, Trevor bought out my share. The valuation was fair. I made sure of that by getting an independent assessment. I could have made it ugly. I chose not to. Partly because I'm not built for ugly, and partly because I had 7 employees who'd done nothing wrong, and I didn't want their livelihoods caught in the crossfire. I took the buyout, and I was done. What I did next, I'll be honest, wasn't entirely calm and measured. I rang Lorraine, Trevor's wife, the woman who'd been to Queenstown with Wendy, the woman who'd sat at my Christmas table, and who I'd always liked, a quiet, sensible person who worked as a nurse, and who I thought deserved to know the truth from me rather than from rumor or from Trevor's version of events. I rang her and I said, "Lorraine, I need to tell you something, and I want to tell you directly, because you're a decent person and you deserve to hear it that way." I told her what I knew, not speculation, not emotion, just what I knew. She was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "How long?" I said I believed it was about 8 months, based on what I'd been told. She said, "Thank you for telling me." She hung up. I heard later through people we had in common, the way these things travel in Christchurch, that Lorraine had filed for separation within 3 weeks of that call. I don't know what happened after that. It's not my story to follow. I also sent an email to the 2 people in our wider social circle who I knew had been aware of what was going on and had said nothing to me. Not a long email. Not an angry one. Just a short note to each of them saying that I was aware they had known, that I didn't need a response, and that I'd be stepping back from the friendship. Wendy was furious about the call to Lorraine. She said I'd done it to hurt Trevor. I told her I'd done it because Lorraine deserved the truth and because I wasn't willing to carry someone else's secret. She said I was being vindictive. I said I was being honest, and that she might want to think carefully about whether she was the right person to be criticizing someone for what they chose to tell and not to tell. That was the sharpest thing I said to her in the whole process. I'm not ashamed of it. We separated formally about 6 weeks after that Tuesday in the kitchen. I moved into a rental property in Sumner, a little place up above the beach that I'd actually done some work on years earlier, so I knew the pipes were good. I used to sit on the deck in the evenings and watch the light change over the water and try to figure out who I was at 62 years old, without the business, and without the marriage that had organized my life for 3 decades. It was hard. I won't dress it up. The first 3 months were genuinely difficult, not because I wanted to go back, but because loss is loss, even when what you've lost wasn't what you thought it was. There's a grief to it, a specific kind of grief for the version of your life that turned out to be different from what you believed. My daughter flew down from Auckland twice that winter. My son rang every Sunday morning from Brisbane, without fail. My grandchildren sent me drawings in the mail. Actual drawings. On actual paper. Posted in little envelopes, and I put them up on the fridge in the rental. And they were the first thing I saw every morning. I want to say something about that, because I think it's important. The people who showed up for me weren't the ones I would have predicted. My kids were extraordinary. An old mate from my apprenticeship days, a man named Walter who I hadn't seen in years, rang out of the blue because someone had told him what was happening, and we ended up having a 4-hour lunch at a pub in Littleton and talking about everything except what had happened, which was exactly what I needed. My neighbor in Sumner, an older woman named June who'd been widowed a couple of years earlier, used to leave things on my doorstep, sometimes a container of soup, sometimes just a clipping from the paper she thought I'd find interesting. Small things. Real things. What I also want to say is this. I was angry. For quite a while. Not the kind of anger that makes noise, I'm not that sort of man, but the quiet kind that sits in your chest and colors everything slightly gray. I was angry at Wendy. I was angry at Trevor. I was angry at myself. A bit. For not seeing it. And I was angry, in a way that surprised me, at the idea that I was supposed to be dignified about it, that I was supposed to process it quietly, not make trouble, be reasonable, be the bigger person. I want to talk to that for a moment, because I think it matters. I've noticed, and this is something I've thought about a great deal since all this happened, that there's a particular kind of pressure on men, especially men of my generation, to handle betrayal with silence, to keep things private, to not let people see you've been hurt, to be stoic. And stoicism has its place. I've never been someone who believes in making your private pain into a public spectacle. But there's a difference between stoicism and suppression. There's a difference between keeping your dignity and pretending you're not injured when you are. I was injured. And I think it was important for me, and maybe for the people around me, that I acknowledge that, honestly, at least to the people who mattered. The practical decisions I made ending the business partnership cleanly, telling Lorraine the truth, stepping back from friendships where people had chosen complicity, those weren't acts of revenge. They were acts of clarity. I was removing myself from situations that had become dishonest, and being honest with people who'd been deceived the same way I had. There's a difference, and it's worth understanding. The divorce was finalized about 14 months after that Tuesday. It was painful in the way these things always are. Not just emotionally, but practically, and in terms of your identity. I'd been a husband for 31 years. That's a long time to be one thing, and then have to figure out who you are without it. I'm 63 now. I live in a small house I bought in Governor's Bay, tucked up in the hills above Littleton Harbor, which I love. I still do occasional work, mostly consulting on commercial jobs, which lets me keep my hand in without the pressure of running a business. I have a good life. I have my kids and my grandchildren, and a dog named Biscuit who has absolutely no respect for personal space, but provides excellent company on long walks. I've been asked, a few times, whether I regret how I handled things, whether I was too cold, too deliberate, too unbending. I don't think so. I think the way you handle the worst things that happen to you says something true about who you are. Not the version of yourself that performs for other people, the actual you. Underneath, when everything else has been stripped away, I found out, going through this, that I'm someone who needs honesty more than comfort. Someone who would rather face a hard truth head-on than live quietly in a soft lie. I think that's a reasonable thing to be. At 63, Wendy and I have no contact now. That's her choice. As much as mine, there was nothing left to say, and no shared children left at home to navigate around. I heard through my daughter that she'd moved to Nelson. I wish her no particular harm. I feel, when I think about her, a kind of quiet sadness, not for what happened, but for the 31 years that turned out to be different from what I thought, and for the fact that whatever she was trying to find, she went looking for it in a way that cost us both enormously. Trevor I haven't spoken to since that day in Rolleston. The business he bought from me is still operating, as far as I know. I pass one of their vans occasionally on the road and feel nothing, particularly. Or perhaps something very small, the ghost of something and then nothing. Lorraine, I bumped into once, at a supermarket in Sydenham about a year after everything. We stopped and spoke for a few minutes. She looked well. She thanked me again, briefly, for the phone call. I said I was glad I'd made it. We went our separate ways. I found myself hoping things had gone all right for her. Walter, my old mate from my apprenticeship, is now someone I see every few months for a long lunch somewhere. I'd lost track of him for almost 2 decades through the busyness of life. Now he's one of the people I'd ring if something went wrong. There's a lesson there too. I think that the connections that matter aren't always the ones that have been most recently maintained. Sometimes there are people from your earlier life who know the version of you that existed before the compromises and the accommodations, and talking to them is like finding something you forgot you'd lost. My grandkids visited last month. 4 of them, between the ages of 3 and 9, unleashed into my house and my garden and into poor Biscuit's personal space for a long weekend. My son came down from Brisbane with his wife. My daughter drove down from Auckland. We ate too much and stayed up too late, and talked about everything and nothing. The 3-year-old fell asleep on my lap after dinner on Saturday night, and I sat there in my chair above the harbor and thought, this is the good thing. This is what's real. This is what lasts. I'll say a few things plainly, because I think they're worth saying. If you find yourself in a marriage that has gone quiet and distant, that's not the end of the conversation. That's the beginning of one. Have it. Don't let the silence grow into something that becomes a reason to go elsewhere. The conversation is hard, but it's the honest thing, and it gives both people the chance to respond and to choose. A secret is not a solution. It's just a choice to be dishonest, made repeatedly, until it becomes impossible to contain. If someone betrays your trust in love, in friendship, in business, you are allowed to feel the full weight of that. You are allowed to be angry. Dignity doesn't mean performing calm when you're not calm. It means acting with integrity even when you're hurting, which is a different thing entirely. And if you are a man of my generation, raised to be stoic, to handle things quietly, to not show your wounds, I'd ask you to consider the difference between strength and suppression. Real strength, I've come to think, is being honest about what has happened to you and responding to it with clarity, not pretending it hasn't happened at all. The people who showed up for me weren't the ones I'd have predicted. Be one of those people for someone else when the time comes. Leave something on their doorstep, ring out of the blue, show up at the job site just to make sure they're all right. The small things are usually the real ones. I'm 63 years old. I live in a good house, above a beautiful harbor. I have a dog who loves me unconditionally, and grandchildren who send me drawings in the mail. I am not the same man I was before that Tuesday afternoon. I think, on balance, I might be a better one. And I will say this. I am stronger for having gone through it, and I am clearer about who I am and who I want around me than I have ever been in my life. That clarity cost a great deal, but it is mine, and I wouldn't trade it back. I've thought a lot over this past year about the word consequence. Not in a heavy-handed way. I'm not someone who believes the universe is keeping score, or that people always get what they deserve in some tidy, measurable way. Life doesn't work like that, and anyone who's lived long enough knows it. But I do believe that the choices we make, repeated over time, become the conditions we live in. And that's not fate. That's just cause and effect, playing out slowly enough that we sometimes forget we set it in motion ourselves. Wendy made a choice. Then she made it again and again for 8 months. Each time she sat across from me at dinner and said nothing, that was a choice. Each time Trevor shook my hand on a job site or laughed at something I said over coffee, that was a choice. Small choices, maybe in isolation, but they accumulated into something that couldn't be contained, and when it came undone completely, for all of them. I think about that when I hear people say that cheating is a mistake. I've said it in this story, and I'll say it plainly again. It isn't. A mistake is forgetting to lock the back door. A mistake is sending an email to the wrong person. What Wendy and Trevor did required sustained, deliberate effort across nearly a year. That's not a mistake. That's a long series of decisions, each one made with full awareness. And the consequences that followed the end of a marriage, the dissolution of a business, the end of Trevor and Lorraine's relationship, those weren't punishments handed down from somewhere. They were simply the natural result of what was chosen. I'm not saying I'm blameless in the broader picture of my marriage. I've already said I wasn't fully present in those last years, that I let the business absorb what should have gone to us. I own that. But owning your part in a marriage going cold is very different from owning someone else's decision to betray it. Those are separate things. And it matters to keep them separate because if you blur them together, you end up carrying guilt that doesn't belong to you, and that's a weight that will quietly crush you if you let it. What I want to say to anyone sitting with something like this, and I suspect there are more people than you'd think, is that your integrity is the one thing that genuinely belongs to you. Not your job, not your relationship, not your reputation. Those can all be taken or changed without your permission. But the way you choose to act, when the worst is happening, when you're hurt and angry and blindsided, that is entirely yours. I chose to be honest with Lorraine because she deserved the truth. I chose to end the business fairly because my employees deserved that. I chose to say very little to Wendy, and to mean every word of what little I did say. Those choices cost me nothing I wanted to keep, and they are the ones I look back on without regret. Resilience, I've come to understand, isn't about not being hurt. It's about what you do while you're hurting. It's about still getting up in the morning and going to work and being decent to people when everything underneath feels broken. That's not performance. That's the actual practice of it. And it builds something quietly, slowly, that gets you from one side of the hard thing to the other. I'm on the other side now. It took time, and it wasn't a straight line, and there were evenings in that little rental in Sumner when I sat on the deck and felt the full weight of it. But here I am, 63 years old, clearer than I've ever been, living a life I actually chose. That's enough. More than enough, as it turns out,